Close your eyes for a moment and picture the great empires of history. You might see the pyramids of Egypt, the golden palaces of Mali, or the castles of medieval Europe. But few imagine Africa's eastern shores, where coral-stone cities sparkled under the tropical sun, where ships sailed across the Indian Ocean carrying gold, ivory, spices, and ideas. This was the Swahili Coast, a chain of African city-states stretching for thousands of kilometers along the shores of today's Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Somalia, and islands like Zanzibar, Pemba, and Kilwa here. Africans built magnificent cities, bustling ports, and a thriving maritime empire that connected Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and even China, centuries before the age of European exploration. Yet this story is erased or forgotten in most history books. The Swahili Coast is often wrongly portrayed as an Arab creation, as if Africans were just passengers in their own story. But the truth is far deeper. The Swahili Coast was African at its core, enriched by connections across the seas. This is the forgotten story of Africa's ocean empire. Long before the rise of the Swahili Coast, Africa already had deep connections with the Indian Ocean world. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as 2000 BC, trade existed between the Horn of Africa and Arabia. Somali and Ethiopian merchants exported frankincense, myrrh, and exotic animals, which became highly prized in the temples and palaces of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and later Rome. By the 1st century, the Greeks and Romans had written detailed manuals like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describing African ports along the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. These ports exported ivory, tortoise shells, and slaves, while importing glass, wine, and fine cloth. This shows that Africans were not isolated. They were part of one of the oldest global trade networks in history, the Swahili Coast. However, would take this trade to an entirely new level. The Swahili Coast as we know it began to flourish around the 7th–8th century AD, as African communities along the coast began to expand their settlements into bustling towns. These people were primarily Bantu-speaking Africans who migrated from the interior of East and Central Africa, bringing with them farming, ironworking, and cultural traditions. Living along the shores, they mastered fishing, sailing, and coastal trade, exchanging goods with inland communities and Arabian merchants, who began to visit more frequently after the spread of Islam. In the 7th century, the word Swahili itself comes from the Arabic word Swahili meaning coast, but the people who lived there called themselves Waswahili. Their culture was African at its foundation, shaped by centuries of interaction with traders across the seas. It was not an imported civilization, it was an African creation, enriched by global connections. At the heart of the Swahili Coast was the Bantu heritage. The Bantu migrations had spread across much of Africa, carrying languages, farming, and metallurgy. The coastal Bantu peoples grew crops like millet, sorghum, and bananas, herded cattle, and smelted iron for tools and weapons. When Arab and Persian traders began visiting East Africa after Islam spread in the 600s, they encountered thriving African communities ready to exchange goods. Over time, many Arab and Persian merchants settled along the coast, intermarrying with local Africans. This gave rise to a blended but African-rooted culture, contrary to colonial myths. These outsiders did not create the Swahili civilization. They became guests and partners in an already existing African world. The result was a culture that was African in language, art, and identity, while also connected to Islam, the Arabic script, and global trade. From the 9th to the 15th century, the Swahili Coast blossomed into a string of powerful city-states. The most famous were Kilwa Kiswahili, once the richest port on the coast, controlling the gold trade from inland Zimbabwe; Mombasa, a bustling hub of trade, politics, and later resistance to Portuguese conquest; Zanzibar, a cosmopolitan island blending African, Arab, and Indian influences. Sofala, the gateway to the gold of Great Zimbabwe. Each city-state was independent, with its own rulers, merchants, and cultural life. They were connected more by trade and language than by political unity, like the city-states of ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy. The Swahili cities thrived on commerce, competition, and cultural exchange. Ships loaded with gold, ivory, timber, and slaves left their ports, returning with silks, spices, porcelain, and glass beads. The Swahili Coast was becoming Africa's maritime empire. One of the greatest legacies of this civilization was its language. Kiswahili is fundamentally a Bantu African language, but with vocabulary enriched by Arabic, Persian, Portuguese, and later English. It became the lingua franca of East Africa, spoken not just along the coast, but deep into the interior through trade networks. Through Kiswahili, African identity fused with global connections. It was spoken in mosques, markets, and royal courts, and carried poetry, oral traditions, and history. Even today, Kiswahili is one of Africa's most widely spoken languages, used by over 200 million people. The birth of Kiswahili proves that the Swahili Coast was not an Arab transplant. It was an African world, shaping global culture. Trade was the lifeblood of the Swahili Coast. From the African interior came gold from the mines of present-day Zimbabwe, ivory from elephants hunted in the savannas, slaves, tragically, who were sold into domestic labor across the Indian Ocean world, animal skins, tortoise shells, and mangrove timber. In exchange, the Swahili cities imported silk and cotton textiles from India and China, spices from India and the Indonesian islands, glass beads and ceramics from Persia, dates, incense, and fine carpets from Arabia. This trade was not small-scale, it was massive. At its peak, Swahili merchants controlled some of the richest gold and ivory trade routes in the world. What made the Swahili Coast so powerful was its position in the Indian Ocean trading network. This was one of the first true global economies. Centuries before Columbus or Vasco da Gama. Arab dhows and Chinese junks sailed the same waters, guided by the monsoon winds. These seasonal winds allowed ships to leave Africa in one season and return the next. Swahili merchants were not passive. They were active navigators and sailors, mastering the ocean and building ships capable of long voyages. Through this network, African goods reached as far as Persia, India, and even China. In return, African cities imported luxury goods that reshaped their urban landscapes. The Swahili Coast was not a backwater, it was a center of global trade. Among all the Swahili cities, Kilwa Kisiwani shone the brightest. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Kilwa controlled the southern trade routes, including the main port for gold from Great Zimbabwe. With this monopoly, Kilwa became fabulously wealthy. Arab travelers described it as one of the most beautiful cities they had ever seen. Kilwa's rulers built grand mosques, coral palaces, and multi-story stone houses, unlike anything seen elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. The famous Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta, visited Kilwa in the 14th century and wrote with astonishment about its splendor. He described it as a city of prosperity, justice, and devotion to Islam. Kilwa's golden age symbolized the height of the Swahili Coast, when African cities were among the wealthiest, most cosmopolitan, and most connected in the world. The Swahili cities were unlike any others in Africa. Houses were built of coral stone and lime plaster, cool against the tropical heat. Streets were narrow, winding through mosques, markets, and palaces. Merchants lived in multi-story homes, while commoners lived in mudandach houses on the edges. Swahili architecture blended African techniques with Arabian and Persian styles, showing once again a culture that was African at its core, but globally connected. Islam became a cornerstone of Swahili identity. Mosques rose in every city, serving not only as places of worship, but as centers of learning and law. But this was not a rejection of African traditions. The Swahili people blended Islam with local customs, from marriage practices to music and storytelling. Their identity was proudly African, yet open to the world. Along the sunlit shores of the Indian Ocean, in the great Swahili cities of stone and coral, life moved to the rhythm of the tides. Traders from Arabia, India, and China crowded the harbors, ships heavy with silk, porcelain, and spices. But if you walked deeper into the winding streets, past carved wooden doors and bustling markets, you would see something remarkable: women standing at the very heart of society. Unlike in many other medieval worlds where women lived in shadows, Swahili women walked openly in positions of influence. They were landowners, inheriting and managing estates that tied families together. Their names could be found on deeds and agreements, securing wealth across generations. When husbands and brothers set sail on long voyages across the ocean, it was the women who kept life steady at home. They managed households, oversaw trade, and kept the flow of goods moving in the markets. Some became poets-composers of elegant Swahili verse that blended African rhythm with Arabic grace, their words carrying stories of love, loss, and wisdom through generations. In courtyards, markets, and gatherings, women shaped culture in ways no stone building could capture. They passed down oral traditions, preserved identity through clothing and style, and built family networks that stretched from one city to another, threads that bound the Swahili coast into a single civilization. These women were not hidden figures. They were the quiet power behind the grandeur of the Swahili world, the voices, the hands, and the hearts that made the coast flourish. In the early 15th century, the great Chinese Admiral Zheng, he led massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean. When his fleet reached the Swahili coast, they were astonished by its wealth. Giraffes, zebras, and ivory from Africa were carried back to China, amazing the Ming Emperor. This moment proves how globalized the Swahili coast truly was. It was part of the same world that linked Beijing, Delhi, Mecca, and Cairo. Everything changed in the late 15th century, when Europeans arrived. In 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed down the coast, marking the beginning of Portuguese intrusion. At first, they were impressed by the city's wealth, but soon they turned to conquest. Portuguese ships bombarded Kilwa, Mombasa, and other ports. Forcing them into submission, the Portuguese disrupted trade networks and weakened the Swahili city-states, beginning their decline. By the 16th century, the glory of the Swahili coast was fading. The Portuguese chokehold on trade, combined with shifting global routes, left many cities impoverished. Kilwa, once a beacon of wealth, fell into ruins. Mombasa and Zanzibar survived, but never regained their former golden age. The Swahili coast had been one of the great civilizations of Africa, but like many empires, it too faced decline. Colonial historians later erased much of the Swahili coast's African identity. They claimed these cities were built by Arabs or Persians, denying African genius. Museums in Europe took Swahili artifacts, while textbooks ignored their story. This was deliberate. If Africans had built such civilizations, it would destroy colonial myths of African backwardness. But archaeology, oral history, and Kiswahili itself prove otherwise. The Swahili coast was an African creation, proudly rooted in the continent. Today, the legacy of the Swahili coast lives on, in Kiswahili, spoken by millions across East Africa, in the stone ruins of Kilwa, Gede, and Lamu, which stand as monuments of African achievement, in the cultural fusion of music, food, and dress that still links Africa to the Indian Ocean world. The Swahili coast reminds us that Africa was not isolated. It was a global player. Centuries before Europe's rise, the Swahili coast was a maritime empire of gold, trade, and power. Its cities sparkled with wealth, its people mastered the seas, and its culture reached across continents. Yet its story was buried, erased, and forgotten. But history cannot be silenced forever. The Swahili Coast proves that Africa was not just the cradle of humanity, it was also a builder of empires, sailors of the seas, and shapers of global history. This is the truth the world must remember.